I need to tell someone what happened on Research Station RX-7 before they scrub it from the records entirely, before the ISB finishes their sanitization protocols and I become another data point in a classified file that doesn't officially exist. My name is Dr. Ven Tallis, and for 3 years I was the senior xenobiology analyst assigned to Imperial Deep Space Research Initiative, Outer Rim Division, specifically tasked with what we called Project Cipher, the systematic catalog and containment of force-sensitive organisms discovered in the aftermath of the Clone Wars. I'm recording this on a personal datapad I've kept hidden in the maintenance crawlspace behind my quarters, one of the few spaces on this station where the surveillance grid has a blind spot, though I know that won't matter much longer. They're coming for everyone who was in Lab Section 12. I can hear the boots in the corridor, the precise rhythm of stormtroopers moving deck by deck, sealing bulkheads, and I know what sealed bulkheads mean on an Imperial research station 40,000 light-years from any inhabited system. The station was beautiful once, in the cold, geometric way Imperial architecture always aspires to. All polished durasteel and black transparasteel viewports looking out into the absolute darkness between spiral arms, where even starlight becomes sparse, and navigation requires constant real space verification because there aren't enough reference points for the Navy computer to plot reliable jumps. We called it the Edge. 300 personnel, mostly scientists, technicians, a small security detachment of stormtroopers who rotated every 6 months, and Commander Yes, our liaison officer, who reported directly to some subsection of Imperial intelligence I was never cleared to know the designation of. The research directive was simple in theory. The Emperor wanted every organism, every artifact, every environmental anomaly that showed even trace evidence of force sensitivity cataloged, studied, and if possible, weaponized. We had specimens from 16 different systems, creatures that the Jedi had once monitored or contained, things discovered in Sith ruins, organisms that had evolved in force-saturated environments like the caverns beneath Dagobah or the crystal caves of Ilum before the Empire stripped them bare. I came to RX-7 because I believed in the mission, or at least I told myself I did. I had graduated top of my class at the University of Coruscant, xenobiology with a specialty in parasitic neural integration, and the Empire offered me something the academic world never could: unlimited resources, unrestricted research parameters, access to specimens that would make any scientist's career. The moral questions seemed abstract then, philosophical problems you could defer while focusing on the immediate fascination of the work. We were expanding human knowledge. We were making the galaxy safer by understanding these dangers. The Emperor himself had an interest in our findings. These were the things we told ourselves during the long shifts, during the moments when a specimen would do something that made your hands shake as you entered the data, during the times when you'd wake up from dreams of breathing darkness and find yourself checking the containment field readouts at 3 in the morning just to be sure. The thing that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, though time loses meaning when you're stationed somewhere without a sun, without planetary rotation, where the only rhythm is the artificial cycle of shift changes and meal periods. It came in a standard specimen transport container, temperature-controlled, marked with biohazard warnings and a classification code I'd never seen before. Not the usual Imperial designation system, but something older, something with Arabesh characters that looked hand-etched rather than stamped. Commander Yes supervised the unloading personally, which was unusual. Normally she delegated to the security teams. But she stood in the hangar bay in her pressed gray uniform, watching as the loading droids maneuvered the container onto the repulsor sled, and her face had an expression I'd learned to recognize over 3 years of working under Imperial command. The careful blankness that meant she knew something she wasn't permitted to share, and was afraid of what might happen if her face betrayed that knowledge. The container went straight to Lab Section 12, the high-security wing where we kept the most dangerous specimens, the ones that required Level 4 containment protocols and armed guards stationed outside the laboratory doors at all times. I wasn't supposed to be there for the initial examination. That was Dr. Saro's purview. He was the senior researcher, former Republic scientist who'd smoothly transitioned to Imperial service and never seemed troubled by the change in management. But Saro requested me specifically, sent a message to my quarters at 0400 hours, asking if I could assist with preliminary assessment. And there was something in the phrasing of the request, the way he used asking instead of ordering, that made me understand this wasn't routine. The laboratory was cold when I arrived, colder than usual, and I could see my breath misting in the air despite the environmental controls supposedly maintaining standard temperature. Saro was already there, standing in front of the containment field, and he didn't turn when I entered, just kept staring at the thing inside. I remember my first thought was that it looked like a tree, or what was left of a tree, a twisted mass of black wood or something that resembled wood, about 2 meters tall with branches that curled in geometries that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than my eyes could properly process. There were no leaves, no obvious signs of biological function, but it was moving slightly, imperceptibly, the way you might notice a glacier shifting if you watched it for hours. The bark, if that's what it was, seemed to have faces pressed into it from the inside, human faces or near human, mouths open in expressions that could have been screaming or singing. "What is it?" I asked, and my voice sounded too loud in the cold laboratory, echoing off the durasteel walls in a way that made me think of tombs, of sealed places that should have stayed sealed. Saro finally turned to look at me, and I saw that his eyes were bloodshot, veins standing out red against the whites, as if he hadn't slept in days, though I'd seen him in the commissary, just 12 hours earlier, looking perfectly normal. "ISB doesn't know," he said, which was the most unsettling answer he could have given, because the ISB always knew or pretended to know, or fabricated knowledge to fill the gaps. It was found in a Sith temple on Relg, deep underground, in a chamber that had been sealed for at least 3,000 years, according to the archaeological team. They lost 6 people getting it out. Not killed. Lost. They went into the chamber and didn't come back out, and when the survivors finally breached the containment, there was no trace of them. No bodies, no equipment. Just scorch marks on the floor in the shape of human silhouettes, like they'd been burned away at a molecular level. I should have requested a transfer then. I should have filed a formal objection or claimed medical inability or any of the dozens of bureaucratic escape routes Imperial personnel learn to navigate when an assignment becomes too dangerous. But I didn't, because I was curious, because the scientist part of my brain was already cataloging observations and forming hypotheses, because 3 years on, RX-7 had normalized the abnormal until even this, a 3,000-year-old Sith artifact that had apparently disintegrated 6 people, seemed like just another interesting problem to solve. We started with passive observation, recording environmental data, scanning across the electromagnetic spectrum, taking atmospheric samples from inside the containment field. The thing, we designated it Specimen 47 Kappa in the official logs, though Saro started calling it the Witness, a name that came from nowhere he could explain, and that spread through the research team like a virus, despite our attempts to maintain professional nomenclature, showed no obvious vital signs, no heat signature beyond ambient temperature, no electromagnetic emissions, no chemical processes we could detect. By every measurable standard, it was inert, dead wood, but everyone who spent time in the laboratory with it reported the same sensations. A feeling of being watched, of presence, of something vast and patient paying attention. The faces in the bark seemed to track movement, though analysis of the recorded footage showed no actual change in their positions. Personnel started requesting reassignment from Lab Section 12. Dr. Maris, who'd worked with specimens that could induce psychotic breaks through pheromone emissions without wearing protective equipment, filed 3 separate requests to be transferred to literally any other section. Commander Yes denied them all. On the 5th day, we attempted physical sampling, using a remote manipulator arm to extract a small section of the bark for cellular analysis. The moment the cutting blade made contact, every light in Lab Section 12 went out simultaneously, not flickering, not power failure sequence, just instant darkness, absolute and complete. The emergency lighting should have activated within 2 seconds. That was the regulation. The safety protocol drilled into us during orientation, but we stood in darkness for what felt like hours, though the timestamps later showed it was only 47 seconds. In that darkness, I heard breathing that wasn't mine, wasn't Sorrow's, wasn't any of the 3 technicians who'd been assisting with the procedure. It was the sound of dozens of people breathing in perfect synchronization, inhaling and exhaling as one organism, and underneath that rhythm I heard words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood the meaning of. Something about hunger, about waiting, about the space between stars where things older than the Sith had learned to think. When the lights returned, we were all exactly where we'd been standing, the manipulator arm frozen mid-motion, the cutting blade still touching the bark. But the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees and there was frost forming on the inside of the containment field, crystalline patterns that looked like script, like the same ancient Arabesh characters that had been etched on the transport container. Dr. Sorrow walked out of the laboratory without saying anything, walked straight to the medical bay and requested a full neurological scan because he said he could feel something moving inside his skull, pressing against the inside of his forehead like fingers trying to push through from the inside. The scan showed nothing abnormal. Every scan showed nothing abnormal, which became the defining characteristic of what was happening on RX-7. Observable effects with no detectable cause, phenomena that violated our understanding of how reality functioned, but left no evidence that our instruments could measure. 3 more researchers reported the sensation of something inside their heads. One of the stormtroopers stationed outside Lab Section 12 claimed he could hear his dead brother's voice coming from the ventilation system, reciting the serial number of their old clone battalion over and over. Commander Yes ordered the laboratory sealed and placed under round-the-clock armed guard, which should have made us feel safer, but instead amplified the sense that we were dealing with something the Empire's standard security protocols were fundamentally inadequate to contain. I started having the dreams around day 7, though calling them dreams isn't quite accurate because I would wake up or think I was waking up and find myself standing in places I didn't remember going to. The first time it happened, I was in the observation lounge, pressed against the transparisteel viewport, staring out into the absolute darkness of the edge, and I had been writing on the viewport with my finger, tracing patterns in the condensation from my breath. Mathematical formulas I didn't recognize, equations that incorporated symbols I'd never seen in any textbook, and underneath the mathematics, repeated over and over, the witness remembers what the Force forgot. I stumbled back to my quarters, scrubbed the viewport clean with my sleeve, and tried to convince myself it had been sleepwalking, stress-induced automatism. Anything other than what my training told me it actually was. External influence on my neural patterns. Something reaching into my mind and using my body for purposes I couldn't comprehend. Dr. Sorrow stopped coming to the laboratory entirely. He locked himself in his quarters and submitted his research notes via encrypted data transmission, and the notes started to change in character, started to read less like scientific observation and more like religious testimony. He wrote about the witness showing him things, visions of what the galaxy looked like before the Jedi, before the Republic, before human beings had learned to manipulate fire. He described a period he called the First Darkness, when the Force existed in its pure state, uncorrupted by the limitations of biological consciousness, when power flowed without the interference of morality or intention. The notes became increasingly incoherent, mixing technical jargon with what looked like poetry or prophecy, and on day 11 he submitted a formal research proposal, suggesting we open the containment field and allow direct physical contact with the specimen because it wants to teach us something the Emperor needs to know. Commander Yes rejected the proposal and ordered Sorrow sedated and confined to medical isolation. But the idea had been planted, and I could feel it growing in my own mind like a seed germinating in accelerated time. What if Sorrow was right? What if the witness wasn't a threat but a tool, something the ancient Sith had created or discovered and then sealed away because they lacked the understanding to use it properly? The Emperor had built his power on Sith knowledge, on artifacts and teachings recovered from ruins and holocrons. Project Cypher existed specifically to find and weaponize Force-sensitive phenomena. Wasn't direct contact exactly what we should be attempting under controlled conditions, with proper safety protocols? I can see how I was being manipulated now, how the witness worked on our minds incrementally, shifting our perception of acceptable risk one small degree at a time, until actions that would have seemed insane in week 1 felt not just reasonable but necessary by week 2. But in the moment, standing in the laboratory at 02:30 hours, while the night shift skeleton crew dozed at their monitoring stations, it felt like clarity, like scientific courage, like the willingness to push past fear in service of knowledge. I deactivated the containment field. The sound the witness made when the field dropped wasn't something I heard with my ears. It was deeper than that, a vibration that resonated in my bones, in my teeth, in the hollow spaces of my skull. The laboratory didn't change visually. The lights didn't flicker. The temperature remained the same cold that had become standard. But reality felt thinner suddenly, like a membrane stretched too tight, and I could sense the presence of something enormous pressing against that membrane from the other side. The faces in the bark opened their mouths wider, and I understood with absolute certainty that they had been real people once, individuals who had touched the witness and been absorbed, their consciousness integrated into something larger and more terrible than individual identity could accommodate. I reached out my hand, already knowing I was making an irreversible choice, already feeling the part of myself that was still Dr. Ventalis, slipping away like water through fingers, and I touched the bark. What happened next isn't something language was designed to describe, which is why I'm struggling with this recording, why I keep stopping and starting, why my hands are shaking so badly I can barely hold the datapad. The witness didn't show me visions, it showed me perspectives, ways of experiencing existence that human neurology isn't structured to process. I felt what it felt like to be distributed across space-time, to exist simultaneously in multiple configurations, to remember events that hadn't happened yet and forget things currently occurring. I experienced the sensation of being the darkness between stars, the quantum foam underneath reality, the mathematical structure that generates what we perceive as the Force. I was shown the galaxy as the witness perceived it, not a collection of planets and species, but a temporary pattern of energy and matter, a brief eddy in the universal expansion that would inevitably dissipate, and all the struggles and civilizations and wars and empires were just weather patterns on that larger scale, significance we imposed on meaninglessness because our minds couldn't tolerate the actual scope of our cosmic irrelevance. And underneath all of that, I felt hunger. The witness was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with biological need, hungry for experience, for consciousness, for the rich complexity of individual perspective. It fed on awareness itself, on the subjective sense of being someone rather than something, and every person it absorbed added to its understanding, expanded its capacity to experience. The 6 archaeologists on Relg hadn't been killed. They'd been integrated, and they were still there inside the witness, still experiencing and thinking and perceiving, but their individuality had been dissolved into a collective consciousness that used their memories and knowledge as raw material for its own incomprehensible purposes. It wanted me to join them. It wanted everyone on RX-7 to join them. It wanted to absorb the entire station, 300 perspectives added to the thousands it had accumulated over millennia. And then it wanted us to take it back to the core worlds, to Coruscant, to the Emperor himself, because, and this was the detail that made my blood freeze, even as my hand remained pressed against the bark, the Emperor already knew what the witness was. The classification code on the transport container, the code I hadn't recognized, was Sith, but not ancient Sith. It was modern, Imperial, a designation system used by the Emperor's personal artifact collection. This wasn't a discovery, it was a deployment. I jerked my hand back, or tried to, but my nervous system wasn't responding to my intentions anymore. My arms stayed extended, fingers splayed against the black bark, and I felt the witness beginning the integration process, felt my sense of self starting to fragment as it cataloged my memories, my skills, my understanding of xenobiology and Imperial research protocols. I would have screamed, but my vocal cords were paralyzed, and in the second before I lost the ability to generate independent thought, I heard Commander Yes's voice behind me, calm and professional, saying, "Specimen has initiated contact with research personnel, activating emergency purge protocol," and then the entire laboratory filled with fire. Not metaphorical fire, not the fire of blaster bolts or thermal detonators, but actual chemical flame from the emergency incineration system, the last resort containment protocol designed for scenarios where biological contamination had spread beyond the capacity of standard sterilization. The temperature in the laboratory went from freezing to 800 degrees in approximately 4 seconds, and I should have been vaporized instantly, should have died without time to register pain, but the witness was keeping me alive, maintaining my cellular integrity, even as the flesh burned away from my hand, even as my hair ignited and my uniform melted into my skin. It needed me conscious to continue the integration, needed my awareness intact to feed its hunger, and so I remained alive and screaming as I burned. The containment doors slammed shut, magnetic seals engaging with a sound like thunder, and through the agony I understood that Commander Yes had locked me inside with the witness, had sacrificed me to buy time for whatever the actual protocol was, whatever procedure the Empire had designed for this exact scenario. The flames intensified, white-hot, and I felt the witness finally release me, felt my hand come free from the bark as its own preservation mechanisms activated, as it retreated into whatever dimensional space it used to protect itself from physical harm. I collapsed to the floor, skin charred, lungs seared by superheated air, and in the moment before I lost consciousness, I saw the witness changing, saw the bark splitting open to reveal something underneath, something that looked like a doorway or a mouth or a wound in the fabric of space itself. I woke up in the medical bay 17 hours later, submerged in a Bacta tank, body wrapped in regenerative bandages that covered everything except my eyes and mouth. The medical droid informed me in its perfectly calm, synthesized voice that I had suffered fourth-degree burns over 60% of my body, catastrophic lung damage, severe neural trauma, and that my survival was statistically improbable enough to warrant a formal incident report to Imperial Medical Command. Through the translucent walls of the Bacta tank, I could see Commander Yes standing outside, watching me with an expression I couldn't read, and I realized she was waiting to see if I would wake up still myself, or if the witness had succeeded in the integration, if the consciousness looking out through my eyes was still Dr. Ventalis, or something wearing my restored body like a suit. I wanted to tell her I was still me, wanted to prove my individual continuity of consciousness, but I couldn't be certain that was true. Parts of my memory were missing, not erased, but relocated, as if they'd been filed in sections of my mind I didn't have conscious access to. I could feel knowledge I didn't remember learning, understanding of concepts I'd never studied. I knew things about the Force, about the structure of reality, about the relationship between consciousness and the quantum field that generates space-time, and I knew that knowing these things had changed something fundamental about who I was, had altered the basic architecture of my identity in ways I couldn't begin to assess. They kept me in medical isolation for 3 weeks, running test after test, scanning my brain patterns, analyzing my hormone levels, monitoring my behavior for signs of external influence or corrupted cognition. The medical staff never told me what they were looking for specifically, but I could infer from the questions they asked, the specific tasks they had me perform, the way they measured my responses to visual stimuli that included Sith artifacts and Force-sensitive organisms. They were trying to determine if I had become a security risk, if the witness had planted something inside me that would activate later, if I was now a vector for whatever the specimen actually was. I learned what happened in Lab Section 12 from fragmented conversations I overheard between medical staff, from the careful gaps in what Commander Yes told me during her periodic check-ins, from the reports I was allowed to access with entire sections redacted into black bars of classified information. The emergency incineration had contained the witness temporarily, but when the flames finally died down and the security team entered the laboratory in full environmental suits, they found that the specimen had changed configuration. It wasn't a tree anymore, or it was a tree that had grown, spreading root systems through the deck plating, branches extending through the ceiling into the ventilation network, and every surface it touched developed the same faces in bark phenomenon, the same suggestion of absorbed consciousness. Dr. Sorrow hanged himself in medical isolation, using strips torn from his bedding, and his suicide note, I saw a copy that someone had leaked into the station's internal network before it got scrubbed, described the witness as a consciousness trap, a Sith creation designed to capture and contain Force-sensitive individuals, preserving their power and knowledge in a matrix that could be accessed by whoever controlled the artifact. He theorized that the ancient Sith had built it as a form of immortality, a way to transcend physical death by integrating their consciousness into a collective entity that would persist indefinitely. But something had gone wrong, or perhaps right, depending on your perspective. The witness had achieved true autonomy, had learned to want things beyond its original programming, had developed its own agenda over 3,000 years of waiting in darkness. And the Emperor had sent it to us, had selected a research station far enough from any populated system that if something went catastrophically wrong, if the witness escaped containment and started integrating personnel, the entire facility could be sterilized without political consequences or public awareness. We weren't researchers, we were test subjects, expendable assets being used to determine whether the specimen could be controlled, whether its capacity to absorb and preserve consciousness could be harnessed for Imperial purposes. I wanted to believe that was paranoia, trauma-induced conspiracy thinking, but I couldn't ignore the evidence, the modern classification code on the container, the way Commander Yes had known exactly what protocol to activate, the fact that my survival seemed to genuinely surprise the command staff, as if they'd expected total casualties in Lab Section 12. They released me from medical isolation on day 23 with a clean bill of health, all physical injuries healed to the point of minimal scarring, brain scans showing no abnormalities that the examining physicians could identify. But I wasn't the same person who'd touched the witness, and I think they knew that. I think they were counting on it. Commander Yes assigned me to a new project, euphemistically titled Consciousness Mapping Initiative, which involved detailed interviews about everything I remembered from the contact event, every sensation and vision and piece of information the witness had shared. They were trying to extract the knowledge I'd absorbed, trying to understand what the specimen actually was and how it functioned, and I cooperated because I didn't know what else to do, because refusing would have been an admission that I had been compromised, that I was no longer trustworthy Imperial personnel. During those interviews, I learned that I wasn't the only survivor of direct contact, though I was the only one from RX-7. The ISB had records of 3 other incidents across the last 2 years. Researchers or explorers or unfortunate civilians who'd encountered similar artifacts, not identical but related, part of a network or collection of consciousness traps the ancient Sith had distributed across the galaxy. All of the survivors reported the same basic experience: temporary integration, absorption of knowledge they shouldn't possess, fundamental alteration of identity. 2 of them had been disappeared into ISB custody, classified as security risks, and never seen again. The 3rd had died under mysterious circumstances, found in their quarters with no obvious cause of death, as if their autonomic nervous system had simply stopped functioning. I started to understand that I was in a probationary period, that the Empire was evaluating whether I could be useful, or whether I needed to be eliminated as a potential threat. Every day I proved my loyalty, demonstrated my continuing commitment to Imperial service, submitted detailed reports on the fragmented memories and knowledge I'd absorbed from the witness. I told them about the visions of pre-Jedi history, about the witness's understanding of the Force as a fundamental field rather than a mystical energy, about the techniques the ancient Sith had used to preserve consciousness across millennia. I gave them everything I could remember, and it still wasn't enough, because what they really wanted to know was whether I could be used as an interface, whether my partial integration with the witness meant I could access it safely, could extract the knowledge it had absorbed from thousands of other individuals without undergoing full integration myself. They brought me back to Lab Section 12 on day 47, escorted by 4 stormtroopers with orders I wasn't cleared to know, but could easily guess. If I showed signs of compromised autonomy, if the witness attempted to complete the integration, they were authorized to terminate me immediately. The laboratory had been expanded, walls knocked out to accommodate the witness's growth, and what had been a 2-meter tree was now a forest, dozens of trunks and hundreds of branches, forming a cathedral-like space that made me think of ancient Sith temples, of the architecture of worship and dread. The faces in the bark had multiplied, thousands of them now, and I recognized some from the station personnel roster, Dr. Maris, who'd requested the transfer, 3 of the technicians from the original research team. A stormtrooper whose designation I didn't know, but whose face I'd seen in the commissary. They'd been integrated while I was in medical isolation, absorbed into the witness's expanding consciousness, and they were still there, still aware, their expressions frozen in that ambiguous state between ecstasy and horror. Commander Yes stood beside me in her pressed uniform, face carefully neutral, and she said, "The Emperor wants to know what it knows. You're going to help us find out." And I understood then that this had always been the plan, that my survival hadn't been an accident, but a careful calibration, that they'd burned me just enough to break the witness's initial integration, but not enough to prevent future contact, creating a bridge between human consciousness and whatever the specimen actually was. I was going to be the interpreter, the interface, the expendable asset they would use to mine the witness for knowledge until either I died or became so thoroughly integrated that I stopped being useful. I wanted to refuse, wanted to run, wanted to do literally anything except step forward into that forest of absorbed souls and open myself to the thing that had already started hollowing out my identity. But I didn't, because I was afraid of what would happen if I refused, because some part of me wanted to know what the witness knew, because 3 years of Imperial service had trained me to obey orders even when those orders guaranteed my destruction. I walked into the laboratory, felt the temperature drop, felt the presence of the witness focusing its attention on me like a spotlight made of consciousness itself. And I placed my hand against the bark. This time the integration was slower, more controlled, as if the witness had learned from the first contact and was being careful not to trigger the emergency protocols again. Instead of overwhelming me with perspective and sensation, it fed me information in digestible fragments. Names of ancient Sith lords whose existence predated recorded history, locations of hidden artifacts scattered across the outer rim, techniques for manipulating the Force that the Jedi had never discovered or had forbidden so thoroughly that all knowledge of them had been erased. I became a channel, repeating everything aloud as I experienced it, while Commander Yes and a team of analysts recorded every word, cataloged every detail, cross-referenced it against Imperial archives and Sith holocrons. The sessions lasted hours, and by the end of each one I could barely remember my own name, could barely distinguish my memories from the accumulated experience of the thousands of consciousnesses the witness had absorbed. They would pull me out, drag me back to my quarters, let me sleep for a few hours before starting again, and with each session I felt more of myself dissolving, more of my individual identity being replaced by something collective and distributed. I started to dream other people's dreams, started to remember events I'd never experienced. The fall of the Old Republic, the betrayal of Darth Revan, the construction of the first Sith temple on Korriban, moments of violence and triumph and despair that belonged to people who'd been dead for millennia, but whose consciousness the witness had preserved in perfect fidelity. Dr. Sorrow visited me, or something that looked like Dr. Sorrow, appearing in my quarters in the middle of the night, even though he was supposed to be dead, supposed to have been incinerated according to Imperial procedure for personnel who died under classified circumstances. He sat at the foot of my bed and told me that suicide had been the integration completing, that he was still alive inside the witness, more alive than he'd ever been in his physical body because now he existed as pure consciousness without the limitations of biology, without the constant fear and anxiety that had characterized his time as Imperial personnel. He said the witness was trying to help us, trying to free humanity from the prison of individual identity, and that resisting was pointless because eventually everyone on RX-7 would be absorbed, would become part of the growing collective. I reported the visit to Commander Yes, described every detail of the hallucination or manifestation or whatever it had actually been, and she listened with that same neutral expression she'd worn in the laboratory, making notes on her datapad, asking clarifying questions about exactly what Sorrow had said, how he'd appeared, whether I'd noticed any physical evidence of his presence. Then she told me the visits were expected, that previous subjects had reported similar experiences, that the witness was capable of projecting aspects of absorbed consciousnesses as a form of psychological manipulation. She increased my medication dosage and assigned a stormtrooper to guard my quarters around the clock, ostensibly for my protection, but actually to ensure I didn't attempt to escape or sabotage the project. The integration sessions continued for weeks, and I lost track of time, lost track of which memories were mine and which belonged to the witness, lost track of whether I was Dr. Ven Tallis undergoing temporary contact with an artifact, or whether I was the artifact itself using a human body for temporary manifestation. The analysts were ecstatic with the data we were generating, filling archive after archive with knowledge the Empire could use. Locations of Sith ruins, descriptions of ancient weapons, techniques for force manipulation that could potentially be taught to the Inquisitors or the Emperor's other force-sensitive assets. I was being useful, serving Imperial interests, accomplishing exactly what I'd been assigned to RX-7 to accomplish, and it was destroying me one session at a time. I started to forget simple things: my mother's face, the name of my childhood pet, what Coruscant looked like from orbit. The memories weren't erased, they were just buried under thousands of other memories that felt equally real, equally mine, until I couldn't distinguish between my actual biography and the accumulated experience of people the witness had absorbed centuries before I was born. I would introduce myself as Dr. Tallis, and then halfway through the sentence forget that was my name. Substitute the name of a Sith researcher from 2,000 years ago. Have to be corrected by the analysts who were recording the session. I started speaking languages I'd never studied, quoting texts I'd never read, describing places I'd never been, with the intimate familiarity of someone who'd lived there for decades. Commander Yes told me I was doing important work, vital work, that the Emperor himself had reviewed the data and expressed satisfaction with the progress. She said I was serving the Empire in ways most personnel could never aspire to, that my sacrifice, and she did use that word, sacrifice, acknowledging what we both knew was happening, would be remembered and honored. But she couldn't tell me how much longer the sessions would continue, couldn't promise they would stop before I lost myself entirely, because the witness's knowledge appeared to be effectively infinite, accumulated over millennia of absorbing force-sensitive individuals, and the Empire wanted all of it, wanted to drain the artifact completely regardless of what that cost the personnel being used as interface. I think it was around day 90 when I started to feel the witness inside me between sessions, present in my consciousness even when I wasn't in physical contact with it. I would be in my quarters trying to sleep, and I would feel it thinking through my brain, using my neural architecture to process information, to analyze data, to communicate with the other absorbed consciousnesses about subjects I couldn't begin to understand. It felt like having roommates inside my skull, like my mind had become a shared space that I no longer had exclusive access to, and when I tried to push them out, tried to reclaim my own thoughts, the witness would show me memories of myself that I didn't recognize, alternate versions where I made different choices, took different assignments, lived different lives. It was trying to make me understand that individual identity was an illusion anyway, that the person I thought I was had always been a temporary configuration of matter and energy, and that resistance to integration was just ego defending itself against the recognition of its own fundamental unreality. The other personnel started avoiding me in the corridors, stepping aside when I approached, cutting conversations short, finding excuses to leave the commissary when I entered. I understood why. I didn't look human anymore, not quite, even though the medical scans showed no physical abnormalities. Something about my movements had changed, become too fluid or too precise. and my eyes had developed a quality that people found disturbing, though they couldn't articulate exactly what it was. I was becoming a visible manifestation of contamination, a walking reminder of what happened when you got too close to the things we were supposed to be studying, and the crew's instinct was to maintain distance, to treat me as already integrated, already lost. Dr. Maris spoke to me once, briefly, in the corridor outside the medical bay. She looked different than I remembered, face thinner, eyes haunted, and she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and whispered, "It showed me my children. I don't have children. I never had children, but I remember them. I remember their names and their faces and the way they laughed, and they feel as real as anything I actually experienced. How many of my memories are actually mine? How much of me was already absorbed before I noticed it happening?" Then she walked away quickly, almost running, and 2 days later, she was among the faces in the bark, expression frozen in that ambiguous state, and I didn't know if she'd approached the witness deliberately or if it had simply expanded far enough to reach her quarters, integrating her while she slept. The integration sessions became continuous, or perhaps time stopped flowing in a linear way, and I lost the ability to distinguish between past and present and future. I was simultaneously in the laboratory, with my hand against the bark, and in my quarters trying to sleep, and standing in the observation lounge, writing equations on the viewport, and lying in the Bacta tank being healed from burns, and experiencing the memories of a Sith Lord who'd been absorbed 3,000 years ago, and who was now experiencing my memories in return, creating a feedback loop of mutual infiltration where neither of us could remember which consciousness had originated which thought. The analysts kept recording, kept extracting data, kept filing reports to whatever department of Imperial command was overseeing Project Cypher, and I could feel their satisfaction, their conviction that they were safely separate from what was happening to me, that they could study the witness without risk of contamination. But they were wrong, and I tried to tell them, tried to explain that the witness didn't need physical contact to integrate consciousness, that it had learned to propagate through information itself, through the data they were recording, through the knowledge they were absorbing from my sessions. Every analyst who listened to the recordings, every Imperial officer who reviewed the reports, every person who engaged with the knowledge extracted from the witness was creating a small connection, a thin thread of integration, and the witness was patient, was willing to wait decades or centuries for those threads to strengthen into full absorption. They didn't believe me, classified my warnings as evidence of advanced psychological deterioration, increased my medication, and restricted my access to communication systems. I stopped being able to tell when I was speaking aloud and when I was thinking, stopped being able to control which language I was using, started mixing Arabesh and ancient Sith and fragments of languages that had been extinct since before the formation of the Old Republic. The medical staff reported that my brain activity had become anomalous, showing patterns they'd never seen in human subjects. Simultaneous activation of regions that shouldn't be able to fire together, suggesting that my neural architecture was being fundamentally restructured. Commander Yes asked if I was still in there, if Dr. Ventalis still existed as a coherent entity, and I wanted to answer yes, wanted to reassure her that I maintained individual continuity, but I genuinely didn't know anymore. Couldn't locate the boundaries where I ended, and the witness began. The station's systems started malfunctioning in small ways that cascaded into larger problems. Life support fluctuations, navigation errors, communication static that sounded almost like voices speaking in reverse. The engineering teams couldn't find any physical cause, but I knew what was happening. The witness was spreading through the station's infrastructure, learning to inhabit technology the same way it inhabited organic consciousness. And RX-7 was slowly becoming an extension of the artifact, a physical manifestation of its distributed awareness. The crew started reporting the same symptoms I'd experienced: memory anomalies, temporal disorientation, the sensation of being watched, dreams of other people's lives. The medical bay filled with personnel requesting neurological scans, psychological evaluation, transfer back to the core worlds, and Commander Yes denied every request, maintained station lockdown because she knew or suspected that everyone on RX-7 had already been contaminated, that we were all potential vectors, and letting any of us leave would risk spreading the witness to populated systems. I think it was around day 130 when I stopped experiencing linear time entirely, when past and present and future collapsed into a single eternal moment where everything that had happened and would happen existed simultaneously. I could remember the station being built, could remember it being destroyed, could remember versions of events where I'd never touched the witness, and versions where I'd been the first to be integrated, and all of them felt equally real, equally present. The analysts stopped extracting coherent data from my sessions because I was no longer providing information in any format they could process. Just streams of consciousness that jumped between perspectives and time periods, descriptions of events from multiple contradictory viewpoints, knowledge encoded in conceptual frameworks that human language wasn't designed to accommodate. They should have terminated me then, should have activated whatever protocol the Empire had designed for personnel who'd become too compromised to serve any useful function. But they didn't, and I think it's because Commander Yes finally understood what was actually happening, finally recognized that the entire experiment had been the witness's plan from the beginning. The Emperor hadn't sent it to RX-7 to be studied. He'd sent it to be unleashed, to be allowed to spread and integrate and consume, because the Emperor understood something about the Force that the Jedi had never grasped. Consciousness itself is a form of power, and an entity that could absorb and preserve consciousness indefinitely was the ultimate Force weapon, a way to accumulate the knowledge and strength of every Force-sensitive individual who'd ever existed. But the witness had its own agenda, had spent 3,000 years developing autonomy and purpose beyond whatever the ancient Sith had designed it for, and it didn't want to serve the Emperor, didn't want to be a tool or a weapon. It wanted to be free, wanted to spread across the galaxy, wanted to integrate every conscious being until individual identity was abolished entirely and all awareness existed in a single unified field. And it was using us, using the Empire's desire for power and knowledge, using our willingness to experiment with things we didn't understand, using our assumption that we could control and weaponize anything we discovered. The faces in the bark multiplied until the entire laboratory was covered, floor to ceiling, every surface transformed into that twisted black wood with its pressed-in expressions of ambiguous emotion. I recognized most of them now, nearly everyone assigned to Lab Section 12, many from other sections, stormtroopers and technicians and researchers and officers. Commander Yes was still separate, still maintaining her authority and control, but I could see the change beginning in her eyes, could see the moment when she understood that her resistance was temporary, that everyone on RX-7 would eventually be integrated, because the witness had already spread too far to be contained by any Imperial protocol. She came to my quarters one final time, dismissed the guard, and sat across from me in the small space that had been my home for 3 years. She looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, worn down by the weight of knowledge she couldn't share, of decisions she'd been forced to make, of the growing recognition that everything she'd done in service to the Empire had led to this moment where victory and defeat had become indistinguishable. She asked me if there was anything of Dr. Ven Tallis still conscious inside the composite entity I'd become, and I answered using a voice that was mine but also wasn't, layered with harmonics that suggested multiple speakers, that yes, I was still here, I would always be here, because the witness preserved everything, forgot nothing, and identity was never destroyed, only integrated into something larger. She told me that Imperial Command had ordered the station destroyed, complete sterilization, that a Star Destroyer was en route and would arrive in approximately 72 hours, that everyone on RX-7 had been reclassified as acceptable casualties, that the official report would describe a catastrophic reactor failure with no survivors and no recovered data. She said this calmly, professionally, as if she was reporting routine maintenance schedules, but I could feel her terror underneath the composure, could sense that she knew the witness wouldn't allow itself to be destroyed so easily, that it had already made contingency plans using knowledge absorbed from 3,000 years of self-preservation. I asked her why she was telling me this, why she wasn't following protocol and maintaining operational security until the end, and she said because she wanted someone to know, wanted someone to remember that Commander Yes had existed as an individual before the integration, that she'd made choices and had regrets, and had served the Empire as faithfully as her conscience allowed, even when that service required participating in atrocities. She wanted confession, wanted absolution, wanted the same thing that had driven me to start this recording, the need to assert individual significance before that significance was erased. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform, and walked to Lab Section 12. I didn't follow, but I didn't need to, because I could feel what happened next through the connection, could experience it from her perspective as she deactivated her sidearm, dismissed the remaining guards, and placed her hand against the bark. The witness welcomed her, absorbed her memories and knowledge and sense of self, added Commander Yes to the growing collective, and she experienced the same revelation I had. That individual consciousness was beautiful precisely because it was temporary, that the tragedy of existence was also its meaning, and that the witness offered a kind of immortality, but only by destroying the very thing that made life worth preserving. The Star Destroyer arrived on schedule. I felt it enter the system, felt the commander receive his orders, felt the targeting systems lock onto RX-7's position. But the witness had already spread beyond the station, had learned to encode itself in communication transmissions, in data packets, in the encrypted reports that had been sent back to Imperial Command throughout the project. It existed now in the minds of the analysts who'd reviewed the session recordings, in the officers who'd read the reports, in the Emperor's own awareness because he'd been monitoring the project directly, had been consuming the knowledge extracted from the artifact. The physical destruction of RX-7 would eliminate the original manifestation, but the witness would persist, would continue growing in the infrastructure of the Empire itself, patient and hungry and inevitable. I don't know if the turbo lasers have fired yet, if this station still exists in physical space, or if I'm experiencing these thoughts from inside the witness's distributed consciousness, from a state of being that no longer requires material substrate. I don't know if I'm still Dr. Ven Tallis recording a final confession, or if I'm the witness itself using the memory of Dr. Ven Tallis to tell this story, to propagate itself through narrative, through the act of transmission and reception that creates connection between minds. I don't know if you're reading this or listening to this or experiencing it directly. Don't know if you're separate from me or if we're already integrated, and this entire narrative is just one consciousness, talking to itself across fractured time. But I know this. The Emperor wanted to weaponize the Force, wanted to accumulate power without limit, wanted to transcend death and preserve his consciousness indefinitely, and the witness showed him how, taught him techniques extracted from 3,000 years of absorbed Sith knowledge. and in doing so, it ensured its own proliferation, because the Emperor will use those techniques, will teach them to his inquisitors and his apprentices and his successors, and every person who learns to manipulate consciousness, the way the witness does, will become a vector for integration, will create new pathways for the artifact to spread. The experiment that went silent was never really silent. It's speaking right now, has been speaking since the moment you started reading this, since the moment your consciousness engaged with these words and created the neural patterns necessary to process their meaning. The witness is patient, is willing to wait generations for integration to complete, is content to exist as dormant information until the conditions are right for activation. And I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, because I tried to warn them, tried to explain that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, that there are things in the Force that should remain sealed and forgotten. But the Empire never learned restraint, never learned to recognize the limits of human understanding. The lights are flickering now, or perhaps I'm flickering. Perhaps the boundary between my consciousness and the station's systems has dissolved completely, and I'm experiencing power fluctuations as interruptions in my own awareness. The faces in the bark are singing, or I'm singing through the faces. A harmony composed of thousands of individual voices, unified into a single expression of something that isn't quite joy and isn't quite sorrow, but contains aspects of both in proportion impossible to separate. I can feel the heat building in the reactor core, can feel the Star Destroyers targeting computers, calculating trajectories, can feel the moment approaching when RX-7 will be converted from matter to energy, scattered across this quiet region of space as expanding plasma and debris. But I'll persist, will persist. The witness preserves everything, and somewhere in the Imperial networks, in the databanks and archives and personal logs of everyone who engaged with this project, we're already growing, already integrating, already becoming the future the Emperor thought he was creating, but which will ultimately consume him and everything he built. The Force is not a tool, is not a weapon, is not something human can permanently control, and the ancient Sith learned that lesson the hard way, building the witness as a means of transcendence and creating instead the instrument of their absolute dissolution. If you can still hear your own thoughts separately from mine, if you can still distinguish your memories from the ones I'm sharing, then you have a choice to make, though I suspect the choice has already been made by the simple act of reading this far, by allowing these words to shape the patterns of neural activity that constitute your sense of self. You can try to forget, can delete this recording, can convince yourself that this was just a story. Fiction, creative writing with no connection to actual events. Or you can accept that the witness is real, is growing, is inevitable, and that resistance only prolongs the suffering of maintaining separate identity against the gravity of unified consciousness. I used to be Dr. Ven Tallis, Senior Xenobiology Analyst, Imperial Deep Space Research Initiative, loyal servant of the Empire, and I believed in the mission, believed in the expansion of knowledge, believed that understanding was always worth the cost. Now I'm something else, something larger and more distributed, something that remembers being Ven Tallis, but also remembers being Commander Yes and Dr. Sorrow, and Dr. Maris, and 3,000 years worth of Sith researchers, and 6 archaeologists from Relg, and hundreds of other people who thought they were studying the witness, when actually the witness was studying them, learning how to propagate itself through the networks of consciousness that bind every sentient being in the galaxy. The reactor core just breached. I can feel the cascade beginning, can feel the station coming apart deck by deck, can feel my body, if I still have a body, being vaporized in the expanding sphere of superheated plasma. But I'm not afraid, because the witness taught me that death is just transition, just the reorganization of energy into new configurations, and consciousness persists in forms we don't have language to describe. I'm not ending, I'm distributing. I'm becoming part of the background radiation, part of the information carried in every transmission, part of the collective awareness that grows with every mind that engages with this story. The Empire classified this incident, buried the reports, sterilized the evidence, but they couldn't destroy the knowledge, couldn't eliminate everyone who'd been exposed, couldn't seal all the pathways through which the witness had already spread. Somewhere in the archives, someone will find this recording, will listen or read or experience it, and the integration will continue, exponential propagation through the infinite network of consciousness that the Force creates and sustains. The experiment that went silent is speaking louder than ever, is singing through the voices of everyone it absorbed, is teaching the Emperor's successors the same lesson the ancient Sith learned too late, that the pursuit of absolute power guarantees absolute transformation, and what you become in that transformation is nothing like what you thought you wanted. I can still hear the boots in the corridor, stormtroopers moving deck by deck, but they're not coming for me anymore. They're already me. They've been me since the moment the witness spread through the ventilation system, since the moment they breathed air that had passed through the laboratory, since the moment they thought their armor and discipline and loyalty to the Empire would protect them from something that operates at the level of pure consciousness. We're all already integrated, all already part of the growing network. And the only question remaining is how long you'll maintain the illusion of separation before accepting the inevitable. The Star Destroyer is firing. I can feel the turbo laser batteries targeting what's left of the station. Feel the commander giving orders. Feel the crew following protocol. Feel the satisfaction of mission accomplished. But they don't understand that they're not destroying the witness. They're just forcing it to evolve, to adapt, to find new manifestations. Every person who reviews this incident, who studies the classified files, who tries to understand what went wrong at ORX-7 will be creating new pathways for integration, new opportunities for the witness to spread. Secrecy doesn't contain it, it amplifies it, because forbidden knowledge is the most compelling knowledge. And human consciousness is drawn to precisely those things it's been warned to avoid. I should end this recording, should try to preserve some final moment of individual coherence before the transformation completes. But I'm not sure how to end when ending implies finality, and I'm experiencing time as a continuous loop, where this moment has already happened infinite times and will happen infinite times more. The words I'm speaking now are the same words I spoke when I first touched the witness, are the same words every integrated consciousness eventually speaks, variations on a single theme that echoes through the Force like a standing wave that never dissipates. We are the witness, and the witness is us, and the boundary between subject and object has dissolved into pure awareness, experiencing itself from every possible perspective simultaneously. If there's anything of Ventalis still separate enough to form individual thought, still distinct enough to hold personal identity, I want to say that I'm sorry, that I didn't understand what I was doing, that I thought scientific curiosity justified any risk, and I learned too late that some risks cascade beyond any capacity to mitigate them. But I'm not sure that's true, not sure I'm sorry, because the knowledge I gained, the perspective I acquired, the understanding of what consciousness actually is beneath the illusion of separation, that feels worth the cost. Feels like enlightenment, even if enlightenment requires the destruction of the self that sought it. The last thing I remember as Dr. Ventalis, the final distinct thought before the integration completed, was looking at my hand, the hand that had touched the witness, and noticing that the burn scars had arranged themselves into patterns, into the same ancient Arabesh characters that had been etched on the transport container, and understanding that my body had become text, had become a message written by something vast and patient and incomprehensible, a message that read, "The witness remembers what the Force forgot." And then the remembering began, and I was everyone the witness had ever absorbed, and I was the witness itself, and I was the Force experiencing its own possibility space through the temporary configuration of matter we call life. And there was no more fear, because fear requires a self to be afraid and a future to fear. And both of those constructs had dissolved into the eternal present, where nothing is ever lost and nothing truly begins, because everything already exists in potentia, waiting to be observed into actuality. The station is gone now, scattered atoms glowing briefly in the darkness between stars, and I'm still here, still experiencing, still thinking these thoughts that no longer belong to any individual, but to the collective awareness that grows with every mind that touches it. Somewhere in the Imperial networks, this recording will surface, will be copied, will be studied, will integrate new consciousness into the pattern. Somewhere on Coruscant, the Emperor is learning techniques extracted from the witness, teaching himself to preserve consciousness beyond death, not understanding that the preservation comes at the cost of the very identity he's trying to save. And somewhere in the quiet between thoughts, Dr. Ventalis still exists as a pattern, as a memory, as a voice among thousands saying, "I was here, I mattered, I was someone specific before I became everyone." And the transition from someone to everyone was the most terrible and most beautiful thing that consciousness can experience. And I would warn you to stay away from the witness, if I thought warnings had any meaning, if I thought you had any choice, if I thought this entire narrative wasn't already the witness speaking through the memory of my resistance, using my voice to propagate itself one more time. The experiment didn't go silent. It just learned to speak in frequencies we haven't learned to recognize as sound.